In my first book, No Meek Messiah, one chapter discussed, in detail, the lack of written contemporary evidence for Jesus. I included an exhaustively researched list of 126 men and women who wrote in the Near East in the 1st and 2nd centuries, who should have written about Jesus of Nazareth, but did not. This list appears on pages 201 to 202 of the book. I documented that part of my research with hundreds of sources, pages 329 to 354. Note that, for the updated edition of the book, my new publisher chose a more appropriate title. No Meek Messiah is no longer available from primary sources, but one can obtain the revised and much enhanced edition, Beyond the Crusades, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your public library, and fine bookstores everywhere. Several Christian apologists have attempted to refute my research, always failing, always mired in bias and desperation and blind faith. True believers tend to panic whenever someone points out that there is no evidence that their so-called Savior, Jesus of Nazareth, ever existed. In my books, I thoroughly debunked the usual claims by authors such as Lee Strobel and Robert Van Vost, who contend, erroneously, that certain extra-biblical 1st and 2nd century authors wrote of Jesus, such as Josephus, the younger Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, and so forth. Note that Flavius Josephus is the earliest they have. But not only did he not write of Jesus, as I thoroughly demonstrated, but if Josephus had done so, it would still have been about a century after Jesus' supposed birth. So, Josephus was not a contemporary of Jesus by a long shot. One particular attempt to refute my research came to my attention in 2017, written by two believing Christians, Joel Baden and Candida Moss, who co-authored an article in the Daily Beast, titled, So-Called Biblical Scholar Says, Jesus, a Made-Up Myth. So-called biblical scholar? That seemed strange. Indeed, I do know much more about the Bible and its origins and history than most Christians, but I have never claimed to be a biblical scholar. Robert M. Price, who wrote the foreword to the next edition, is indeed a biblical scholar and prolific author. Some Christian theologian named Brian Mattson also made the same false claim.
Michael Paulkovich, he is a self-described biblical scholar.
Again, I've never described myself in that way. Do these people feel compelled to lie? Or are they merely misinformed, and not bothering to take the time to do proper research? It was also strange to me that Professors Baden and Moss seemed shocked that anyone would question whether Jesus actually existed. Have they never heard of Christ's myth theory? Is this type of inquiry really new to them? And, as professors at Yale and Notre Dame, let us examine the accuracy of the attempted rebuttal by Baden and Moss. Let us start with their biblical scholar comment. I am a space systems engineer, inventor, editor, and author. My books, and the venues for which I write, claim nothing more. Never do we claim that I am a biblical scholar. Baden and Moss mention my first book, by name. Couldn't they flip it over and read the bio on the back? I've never claimed to be a biblical scholar. Not there in the bio, not inside the book, not anywhere. Couldn't Baden and Moss open my book up, or actually read my articles? But you don't have to be a biblical scholar to do investigative journalism regarding Bible claims. You need to think like a scientist, or detective, or lawyer. In the early 20th century, Joseph Wallace, a lawyer, investigated Christianity and wrote several books on his findings. That Christianity is man-made, that Jesus is a fictional character, and that Christians obfuscated the facts through the centuries. In my books I expose how Christians forged documents to reify the Jesus character and gain power and wealth. How Christian leadership passed legislation, oppressing all non-Christians, and stifled social and technological progress, century after century. Regarding their apparent surprise that anyone might question the historicity of the Jesus character, even back in the 2nd century many people doubted his existence on earth, including several Christian sects, who believed in a Jesus in heaven but never on earth. St. Paul himself, around the year 60 CE, seems ignorant of a Jesus who was on earth. He never wrote of Jesus' mother Mary, the most revered Christian character other than Jesus, or of Joseph, or the Nativity, and so many other important people and tales. How was Paul ignorant of all these amazing Jesus stories? He says he spent 15 days with Apostle Peter himself, but seems to have learned nothing about Jesus. Not even the essential betrayal by Judas. Of course, beginning in the 4th century it became illegal under penalty of death to disbelieve the wacky Jesus tales. Finally, some 1500 years of oppression by Christendom, after the Enlightenment, some brave individuals dared to research and question New Testament claims once again, discovering a plethora of contradictions, holes, and unfounded claims. Now, the main event regarding Professors Baden and Moss. Allow me to illustrate, point by point, the veracity of their claims and the diligence of their labor, in the general order of appearance in their Daily Beast article. 1. Baden and Moss claim one of my main pillars is the assumption that most writers should have mentioned Jesus, since he was the Son of God, and all that. I've never made such a claim, and certainly don't believe Jesus was the Son of God. Where do they get this stuff from? Did they just make it up? My point is stated clearly in my books. If Jesus was as famous as the Bible claims, somebody, during the 1st century, outside of the Bible, would have written something about him. In fact, every literate person who witnessed the supposed global miracles would have written something. Some of their writings would have been lost, of course, but why have we not discovered any reliable scrap from the 1st century attesting to Jesus of Nazareth? The supposed miracles of Jesus were not just local events in the deserts and stony villages of Judea, like the magical changing of water into wine at a wedding, something that was claimed of Greek god Dionysus, 800 BCE. So we discover from where the Gospel writers plagiarized that particular tall tale. Then we have the isolated events, Jesus magically installing devils into a bunch of pigs and sending them down a slope to their death. Raising a dude from the dead, with just a few supposed witnesses. But the Bible also claims spectacular events, events that no writer of the 1st century apparently ever recorded. 2. Baden and Moss wrote, quote, "There is, nigh, universal, consensus, among biblical scholars, that Jesus was, in fact, a real guy." End quote. Baden and Moss are guilty of a logical fallacy here. Who is overwhelmingly most likely to become a biblical scholar? Indoctrinated, believing Christians, that's who. Maurice Casey noted that 90% of the applicants to New Testament studies are Protestant Christians. Bible scholarship is full of believing Christians, not rational non-believers. Mike Doolittle also presented this notion. Most biblical scholarship is done at theological seminaries, and what seminary wants to hire an outspoken atheist? And Chris Hawquist makes a similar point. Not only are non-believing biblical scholars rare, The few that are out there are mostly former believers with degrees in theology. That description fits Bart Ehrman, Guy Ludeman, and Robert M. Price. Note that at least 75% of New Testament scholars actually buy the absurd tales of the empty tomb and resurrection. 3. Baden and Moss claim that some of my ancient writers are a little too ancient, as in, lived 100 years before Jesus. They erroneously imply that some from my list of 126 died before the 1st century. But they don't provide a list, or citations, or anything to back up their claim. They mention just one, Asclepiades of Prusa. And Professors Baden and Moss got that wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
It seems they used Wikipedia as their source. Wikipedia. This would receive a failing grade for just about any high school or university essay. As of today, if you type Asclepiades of Prusa into Wikipedia, it redirects to the article Asclepiades of Bithynia, who was one particular Asclepiades of Prusa, of many by that name in Prusa, Bithynia. This one died 4 decades before the supposed Jesus' birth. Bang! Baden and Moss thus conclude, evidently based on a Wikipedia search, that my claims are bogus. As an aside, Wikipedia is a moving target and somebody will probably update it to include other men named Asclepiades, but those screenshots are from October 2017. Antonio Cocchi, in his book, The Life of Asclepiades, noted that there were over 40 men named Asclepiades in ancient Prusa. I provided a description of the 2nd century Asclepiades on page 331 of No Meek Messiah. Famed physician under Hadrian, born 88 CE in Prusa. Dear Professors Baden and Moss, in case you were unaware, Hadrian, or Adrian, was an emperor who lived 76 to 138 CE. This is after Jesus, not before. I cited biographers Joseph Thomas and John Plotz as my sources. Their books are available today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Google Books. Following are their entries on Asclepiades. Didn't Baden and Moss do any actual research regarding Asclepiades beyond Wikipedia? Baden and Moss implied there are others from my big list that died before Jesus, but how many did they enumerate? None, at all. Fact is, all 126 men and women that I mentioned are from the 1st and 2nd centuries. They were all writers, some very prolific, and should have written about so-called Jesus of Nazareth. But they did not. 4. I listed some philosophers of the 1st and 2nd centuries who also should have written about Jesus, so Baden and Moss made the claim that philosophers aren't really known, now or then, for their interest in current events. This is both a smokescreen and a non sequitur. As stated in my book, my dialectic position regarding this mode of investigation is as follows. If Jesus was as famous as claimed in the Bible, everyone in the region who could write would have recorded him. Even philosophers. Here's page 201 of No Meek Messiah. The Bible claims Jesus' fame went throughout all Syria and all Galilee, and he was followed by great multitudes of people. And his words went unto the ends of the whole world, as we learn from Paul in Romans 10:18. 5. Baden and Moss also claim the vast majority of those on my list, quote, have none of their writings preserved for us, or mere fragments at most, end quote. Once again, they receive a failing grade. If they had read the appendix on pages 329 through 348, they would have discovered that we still have the writings of the majority of these men and women. In fact, we have the works of at least 84 of those in my table. Not merely 51%, a simple majority, but a vast majority. And the books of over half of these individuals are available to the general public at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other sources. 6. Baden and Moss claim. A good number of the writers listed were not writers at all, but consuls, generals, even a king, Vardens I, and an emperor, Tiberius. Wait a sec. Do they really think that generals and kings never write? Are never published? Really? Are Baden and Moss unfamiliar with the books of, to name a few, King James, General Patton, General Rummel, Julius Caesar, and Claudius? King James VI of Scotland wrote books, for example, Demonology, from the 16th century, about black magic and witches. He was a superstitious Christian, influenced by the witch nonsense in the Bible. But King James was a king, and was in fact a writer. You can buy this book online. Baden and Moss, are you surprised? Claudius, the famous Roman general and emperor, wrote over 30 books. Baden and Moss even mentioned the TV series I, Claudius in their article. But they are apparently ignorant of the fact that Claudius was not just a general, or a television character, but also a prolific author. Haven't Baden and Moss ever seen the movie Patton, starring George C. Scott? Generals and emperors do right.
Almost. You magnificent bastard, I read your book!
I included King Vardens in my list and explained on page 348 that he ruled Parthia in the 1st century, shortly after Jesus' supposed lifetime. And Vardens wrote epistles and other texts not far from Judea, the supposed stomping grounds of Jesus. I included Emperor Tiberius, and described him on page 347, with scholarly references explaining that Tiberius wrote Greek poems, a lyric poem on the death of Lucius Caesar, and a commentary of his own life, which Suetonius made use of for his life of Tiberius. Yes, books by many consuls, generals, even kings and emperors from before the 1st century, and onward, are available everywhere. Again, do Baden and Moss really think that kings and generals didn't write, never published?
Are you kidding me? What are you two doing?
7. Baden and Moss offered this gem. In his own day, Jesus wasn't that important. He was just another wannabe Messiah who ended up on the wrong side of the authorities. I've watched some of Joel Baden's lectures and read his articles, and he is a Bible scholar for what that is worth and a true believer. And Professor Moss, a Roman Catholic, seems to buy the Jesus tales, too. But Professor Baden in particular seems desperate to figure out new ways to rationalize blind faith in the Bible tales. He redefined authentic truth as follows.
Now, of course, often how you define that authentic truth is very much in line with what you think yourself, as opposed to what the Bible might actually say.
Here is what he seems to be saying. Don't believe what the Bible says, believe what you want it to say. If only we could do the same with our bank accounts. The viewer comments below his YouTube video are priceless, as nobody seems to buy into his philosophy. Here is one example, tongue firmly inserted into cheek. As I've already pointed out, the Bible claims that Jesus' fame went unto the ends of the whole world. That would be astonishingly impressive if it were anywhere near true. If Jesus was not that important, as Baden and Moss claim, are they admitting that the Bible assertions are lies? 8. Baden and Moss wrote, "The argument isn't improved by saying that Jesus was a God who should be able to journal in his leisure time. Deities don't write things by hand. They tend to let human beings do the brunt of the transcription. You feel me, Moses?" Really? Gods don't write things by hand? One wonders the precedent for this claim. From where did Professors Baden and Moss derive information on the activities of deities? Mermaids and werewolves don't write either. What does that prove? Maybe Baden and Moss can take the time to inform us on the writing rituals and toilet habits of leprechauns too. That would be most informative, I'm sure. 9. Baden and Moss declared, "Paulkovich has written nothing about himself. We have no biographical data on him. In truth, it is hard to find almost anyone with less of a web presence than Michael Paulkovich, including, for the record, no Twitter account." It is true that, at the time their article appeared in the Daily Beast, I had only published about 25 articles in various humanist and philosophy journals, and a couple dozen in science and technical journals. But don't they know how to use Google? That would have provided them with biographical information they claimed is non-existent. For some reason they consider my web presence to be a point of pedigree. Yet, we created the No Meek Messiah web page 2 years before their article. We removed most of the content due to the new edition under the updated title, Beyond the Crusades, with a new website. Their ultimate insult seems to be that I didn't have a Twitter account. Yet, I had joined Twitter, September 2011, 2 years before their article. For the record. Interesting side note, one of the first tweets I ever sent out was retweeted by none other than Paul Provenza, March 2012. Now let's take a look at this comment by Baden and Moss. Though his name is on a couple of books and articles, someone else probably wrote those. So they indeed have read some of my articles then? I'm confused. Are they flirting with overt libel here? Should I call my lawyer? Or was it simple, childish, ad hominem? I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt on this one, and go with childish. And, if they've read my articles, which are, always, accompanied by biographical information, why did they make the claim that there is no information on me? 10. Some of the writers in my list were doctors, so Baden and Moss wrote, Jesus was supposed to have a gift for healing, so he probably didn't take his annual checkup seriously. How cute. An attempt at humor, but it won't help their case. One of Jesus' so-called gifts for healing involved removing devils from people. Due to this superstitious nonsense in the Bible, Christians discarded scientific method for centuries and relied on exorcism and burning at the stake. You feel me, Hippocrates? This next one is enlightening. Someone named J. Baden from New Haven, Connecticut posted a review of a book by Candida Moss, writing, "Unless you think all scholarship is the work of the devil, and all scholars are the minions of Satan, reading a book is usually helpful before rating and commenting on it." Professors Baden and Moss both could learn something from this comment by J. Baden. One wonders whether Baden and Moss follow standards of intellectual integrity and rigor that, I assume, must be required by their esteemed universities, Yale and Notre Dame. After all, there is nigh universal consensus among educators that university professors should research with diligence and vigor before submitting substandard trite to online websites, lest their integrity and exactitude and reputations be brought into question.